À-bas-le-ciel.
So I guess I'm going to add this video to my playlist of kind of book non-reviews. Videos that are not book reviews but are talking about books that really influenced me and were a big part of my life. And with all those reviews, I've really made a point to not go back and reread the source book. It's very much how I remember the books involved today, 10 years later, 20 years later, which is quite different from going back and, rereading the source and what you'd think about it now. So a couple days ago, my girlfriend asked me, I was really surprised at the question. You asked me, have you ever read Aristotle? Now, why did you ask that question? I was really surprised at the question. I feel like I mention Aristotle all the time. But anyway, yeah, go.
I don't remember why I asked. I don't know. You mentioned Aristotle in conversation.
Yeah.
I was like, so have you read Aristotle?
Yeah.
It was really just like a
To me,
innocent question.
To me, it just seemed like a preposterous question because I feel like Aristotle. Like I've recorded over 800 videos on YouTube, but I think maybe 20 of them mention Aristotle. Maybe 30. I don't know. Like quite a few times I've mentioned it, and I think I mentioned it in conversation. It just seemed to me preposterous that I could
remember
have.
the conversation now.
Yeah.
You said that one of your ex-girlfriends took a class in which they were talking about
Right,
it was
feminism,
a women's rights
right.
Yeah, and
It was
a quotation of Aristotle that was taken out of context.
Feminist women's studies class,
Yeah.
right, and discussing the interpretation of what Aristotle actually said about women and so on. Right.
Yeah.
So look, in terms of what Aristotle, and you haven't read any Aristotle. So I find that bizarre. I find that strange. I mean, for you, so let's just talk about, Aristotle as a cultural icon is one of the things to talk about this. What does Aristotle mean to you culturally as a white American from Detroit? No, I mean, I'm serious. What does George Washington mean to you? Like, who gives a fuck about George Washington? Does George Washington symbolize anything positive to you? But I think Aristotle is someone who really does have symbolic and cultural resonance and weight.
Yeah, philosophy and science.
Yeah. I mean, Aristotle is extraordinary because he made the transition from being a pagan philosopher to being a Catholic philosopher. Historically, that is why he is so famous. There was a brief period when the Christian church, what we now call the Catholic Church, suppressed and persecuted Aristotle. And then they kind of figured out that he wasn't as anti-Christian as they thought he was. They got to some of the passages where what he says about the nature of divinity and God. And Aristotle ended up being rehabilitated as kind of one of the few little bits and pieces of antiquity, of pre-Christian philosophy, that could be embraced, or at least remixed, reinterpreted, and revalorized in Catholic Europe. So Aristotle, in a period when Europe, was burning books, was censoring their whole Christian past, when, philosophers like Lucretius or what have you were really, persecuted and so on, where things were regarded as heresies and terrible and what have you, that, Aristotle made the transition from being a pagan and a heretic to being somewhat acceptable within Catholic Europe. So that's why his fame grew as much as it did. There's no real reason. I mean, in a parallel universe, why not Carneades? Why not, indeed, why not Plato? I mean, I think there were a lot of reasons why not Plato, actually. But why not some other philosopher who's now slipped into relative? Why not Democritus himself? Why not Pyrrhonism, what we now call skepticism? There were why not cynicism, for that matter? Cynicism is now used. We use it in the English language in a very different way. But there was a school of philosophers called the Cynics. Well, Aristotle was the guy who won the lottery and made the transition from pagan to Christian enough to being acceptable within Christian discourse. So his fame grew and grew. Now, in my life, Aristotle does have some special significance. I'm not someone who reads these books with the delusion that they contain a message for me, nor that they contain a message for my times. So I do look at Aristotle first and foremost as a remnant of, as a fragment of a very alien culture that in some ways I can never relate to. So if I read a book written in 17th century Africa, I regard that as really alien. By the way, 17th century Portugal, sources I've read from the Portuguese Empire and stuff, they have really alien traditions. I mean, I'm just saying, even relatively recently within Europe, I feel like I'm reading an artifact from a different culture that in many ways I can't relate to at all. I remember even reading some Dutch Empire sources from a couple centuries ago, and the way they open and end like a letter, your worship, Like, wow, it's so alien. I am your humblest slave, your worship. Sometimes you can just go back a couple centuries within Western Europe and really feel you're dealing with a profoundly alien culture. So this is one thing. I don't look at Aristotle as something that's for me or about me or as a message for my times. However, if you come out of a political science background, if you care about politics, then, Aristotle is really, he's defined even some of the words we now use in the English language for politics. This is also true of metaphysics. The word metaphysics itself comes from the title of a work of Aristotle. He had this definitive significance on the development of philosophy, including social and political philosophy. So I guess there was a sense when I was a young man of kind of how can anyone take themselves seriously if they haven't read Aristotle. Now, a lot of people say that about Shakespeare. I mentioned Shakespeare as an example. And come on, with Shakespeare, it's bullshit. You don't need to read Shakespeare. Believe me, I do. I'm going to encourage my own daughter to read Shakespeare. I don't have anything against Shakespeare. But when you think about it, what is there really of such definitive significance in the works of William Shakespeare? I think, frankly, nothing. Have you read some of the sonnets of Shakespeare?
Yeah.
The homoerotic sonnets. It's interesting. He does. He has homoerotic sonnets.
Well, not.
Okay, you didn't read those?
I don't remember
so she had a censored literary class. That's a big question. How gay was Shakespeare? There's a huge stack of academic literature on that, by the way. Oh, I'm sorry. And do you know his sonnet about the dusky woman? Did Shakespeare sleep with black women? That's another one. Yeah. There's a lot about Shakespeare's sex life based on the sonnets, by the way. Anyway, another topic for another video. But my point is, by delving into Shakespeare, by pouring this kind of time and attention, which you can even tell from my joking around. I have spent some time reading Shakespeare, but I don't think you get anything out of it like that. So being serious about political science, being serious about politics, being serious about philosophy, in some ways in reading Aristotle, you're going to puncture that illusion. You're going to deflate that illusion. You're going to move past that kind of aura that his works have taken on, see the reality of what they are. But there's one important sense in which, I found something that was kind of shocking and tremendously important in Aristotle that really changed my perspective on both modern Western politics and the way politics is taught and learned in universities. So in most editions of the complete works of Aristotle, there is one very important work that is omitted, and that is Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. So on the Constitution of Athens is a work attributed to Aristotle that was discovered quite late. It was not influential in antiquity. It wasn't influential in the Catholic period I've already alluded to. It's a modern archaeological discovery, if you like. It's a text that's re-entered, that was lost or largely unknown. It was unknown outside of Egypt. I think it was known within Egypt, and then re-entered the corpus of Aristotle's writing. The view of democracy, the philosophical view of how democracy works, and also the practical explanation of how the democracy of Athens really works in there. And one of the things that came as a stunning, there are many things in there that came to me as a stunning revelation in contrast to the way Aristotle is kind of packaged and modernized for students within academia. But one of them is the word lot, L-O-T. What Aristotle supports is election by lot. He reviles and criticizes election by vote as anti-democratic and as tending towards aristocracy. The whole philosophy of politics and democracy that you get in other longer works of Aristotle, like, he has one book simply called The Politics and this kind of thing, or On Politics, if you want to translate the title. You have to go back and re-examine it, realizing what's made clear in the English translation of the Constitution of Athens, which is that Aristotle is a critic of what we now call electoral philosophy. He is a critic of what we now call electoral democracy. What he supports is election by lot, lottery, electing people at random. His model of human equality and participation, and also his whole criticism of, it's still a huge problem today, of corruption and special interests and conflict of interest. His way to overcome that is you constitute a class of educated people. He's not talking about electing everyone in the society. Athens was a very unequal society. There were slaves and there were slave owners, but where you basically have a group of people a group of men, it's only men, who are qualified to hold public office. And then they are assigned their particular offices in government by lot, by lottery. not by election in our sense at all. And I remember reading that, and it was a stunning moment because I realized the extent to which all my professors have been lying to me. Even my textbooks have been lying to me. The significance of it. And a lot of things Aristotle said that were kind of confusing in the past. Because he does have these kind of confusing, in terms of I was only reading this in English, not in Greek, these kind of confusing criticisms of corruption and democracy, how democracy does and doesn't work. He talks a lot about the way in which democracy tends to slide into oligarchy. And for me growing up in Canada at the time, I could really relate to that.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, for you too, it's like, okay, why did George W. Bush become president? Well, because before him, George Bush Sr. was president. Why did George Bush Sr. become president? Well, because he was the head of the CIA. Why did he become head of the CIA? Because he was a millionaire involved in oil rigs in the Caribbean, and those oil rigs in the Caribbean were, I mean, it's pretty dark, the role of, the extent to which democracy becomes a kind of mask over oligarchy. That was a huge issue for me growing up in Canada. To some extent, we all feel it. And to realize, so that aspect of Aristotle's philosophy, which I had understood in the past, but the English didn't quite make sense, you realize, it's because he's dealing with a difficult to translate contrast. There's a contrast between two types of elections, election by vote and election by lot. So when I knew that, that was a turning point in my life in a lot of ways. And I mean, it deepened for me the sense that if I was going to learn anything at all, I had to learn it as an autodidact. I had to learn it by interrogating primary sources to the greatest extent possible. And, the most easily accessible source of information, whether those are kind of encyclopedia articles or introductory history textbooks, those are almost always in our culture the most dishonest. That you're better off getting a fragmentary and incomplete view of history by working from authentic primary sources, you know what I mean? Which of course have their own type of bias, rather than getting someone's overview of history and politics that has gone ahead and read a bunch of sources for you and smoothed them out and made generalizations about them. Because underneath those generalizations, I mean, to say that the devil is in the details is an understatement. Of course, this is what I would go on to encounter in Buddhism, in First Nations politics, and so many things. It's so easy to give people a kind of reassuring summary, a summation of what a philosophy is about, what a political dispute is about, even what a civil war is about. You know what I mean? You can watch a YouTube video right now about the Spanish Civil War, 20th century war, or about the 7 Years' War, or the French Revolution. And I should say that, sorry. For me, that's even linked to my break away from left-wing politics, from communism. My parents were communists, and I was very much raised to be a communist. But, I had a book that was literally on my bookshelf from my earliest childhood about the history of the Russian Revolution, the creation of communism in Russia. And it contained so many statements that were in this same way true but misleading. You know what I mean? You can say a lot about Aristotle and his philosophy and what he has to say, his perspective on democracy. You can say things that are true but misleading, where I had to realize that so much of what I knew, whether it was about Karl Marx or Western democracy or ancient Greek, was in this sense true but misleading, and that I had to interrogate primary sources, and I was better off having incoherent little fragments of information based on those real sources, rather than any kind of synoptic analytical overview produced by another scholar, by another author, because the level of deception was so high, and indeed the level of self-deception on the part of those authors was so often so high.
À-bas-le-ciel.